Thank you, everyone, for attending the City of Fort Thomas Planning Commission meeting this evening, January 17th. First up is our meeting minutes from November 23.
Dave, I'll move to approve the minutes of the November 15, 2023 meeting as drafted.
I'll second.
Any comments from anyone else?
As a new planning commissioner, should I abstain at this point in time, or do I just show?
And just welcome to our new planning commission member, David Gwenzella, or Gwenzella, is that how you spell it?
Thank you.
Or how you pronounce it? His first meeting with us this evening. Are we good? Approval of the plan, or the planning commission minutes. We have a first and a second. Everybody in favor, say aye.
Aye.
So ordered. Next up, setting the meeting dates for 2024. Historically, we've met on the third Wednesday, third Wednesday of the month at 6:30 p.m. for our normal meetings, and then depending if there's a public hearing or public meeting, public hearing, I guess, then we meet at 7 or 7:30 for those. Does anybody have any desire to change anything? Personally, I'm okay with our current schedule.
I'll move we leave it the same.
Second.
Okay, we have a first and a second to retain the same meeting schedule for 2024 and time. Everybody in favor say aye.
Aye.
And then election of planning commission officers. I think we have chair, vice chair, and secretary, I think.
Dave, we know your chair. Who's the vice chair and who's the secretary?
You go through the process of discussing it and nominating somebody and
No, but I just wondered who would the existing.
Who is the current vice chair and
Vice
secretary?
chair.
there is a
Secretary.
Dave, I thought you were, you mean,
You're the chairman.
Currently,
Right now.
well, or as of 2023, who was the secretary and vice chair?
It was Dan, I think.
I'm the secretary part, you're the.
Was it Dan?
They switched, but Dan Gordon was,
Vice.
yeah.
He was vice chairman, so we're replacing Dan, so we need a new vice chairman and or secretary. And I'm willing to continue as chairman for 2024, if everybody is okay with that. And then I guess, does anybody have interest in being vice chairman? Assuming Dan wants to retain his role as secretary.
Either one.
I'll open it for discussion.
Well, since Jerry isn't here, I would nominate Jerry as.
Jerry, good to be good vice chairman.
Yeah, we can do that,
Can we do that, actually? In an absence of a member?
if you've got a motion, you made a motion for all three.
Yeah.
Second.
All right, then I'll move for the officers for 2024, Dave Wormel for the chair, Jerry Noren for the vice chair, and Dan Geller for the secretary.
Okay, we have a first and second for the officers for 2024. Any further comments? Everybody in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, so ordered, thank you. Okay, our new business for this evening is a review of the zoning ordinance update, phase 3, our first meeting for phase 3 for adoption of the revisions. Tonight we'll be discussing Article 1, which is the general provisions and administrative sections of the code, definitions, measurements, waivers, and modifications, and then also Article 7, which is the subdivision regulation portion of the ordinance. And with that, I'll turn it over to Elisa Duffy and CT Consultants for their discussion.
All right, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
We got
Okay.
it.
As usual, if you can't, just start waving at me, please. Good evening. I am Elisa Duffy Rogers with CT Consultants. With me is Frank Trehus, who is also with CT, and thank you so much for having us here this evening. Tonight, we will start with a brief overview of the zoning and subdivision ordinance update process. We will also review the Phase 3 schedule. As the chair said, we will review the provisions in Article 1 of the Unified Development Ordinance, which includes the general provisions and the administration portion of the ordinance, which also includes all the development review processes. We will also review Article 7, which includes all the subdivision regulations. We will end with next steps. And as usual, I will stop several times during the presentation to hear questions and to answer questions from the community. The zoning ordinance and subdivision ordinance update process is progressing in roughly 4 phases. The first phase included an analysis of existing conditions as well as a thorough examination of both the subdivision and the zoning ordinance. At the end of that phase, we produced a diagnostic report and recommendations, which is available on the city's website. Phase 2 included creating the revised revisions. The major changes from your current code were fleshed out, and we concluded Phase 2 in September of 2023. In order to help, we've got individual chapters that came out at each meeting. In order to help everyone understand and have all of that in one place, we did actually combine all of those documents into a single document, and that is on the city's website as well. And it looks, the cover of it looks like this. So this is the Phase 2 draft with all of the provisions that we considered last year all in one place. Tonight starts Phase 3. During Phase 3, we provide a draft of all the proposed amendments in one place, and we align the zoning map with all the new zoning districts. The Phase 3 draft of the revised zoning and subdivision ordinance is also on the city's website, and this draft indicates how the Phase 3 draft differs from the Phase 2 draft. If you remember, the Phase 2 draft track changes to your existing code. The Phase 3 draft tracks changes to the Phase 2 draft. And if that's as clear as mud, let me know. And then Phase 4 includes the adoption of the new zoning ordinance and map. And then the Phase 3 draft looks like this. This is the cover. As I said, we start Phase 3 tonight. The schedule for the Planning Commission during Phase 3 includes a joint meeting with the City Council on February 20th to discuss outstanding policy issues related to the zoning districts. Then on the 21st, the Planning Commission will consider Article 5 of the Unified Development Ordinance, which includes things like the sign regulations and as well as all the other regulations that are applicable to all the districts. On March 19th and 20th, the Planning Commission will discuss the draft zoning districts, and you will note that that's 2 meetings in 1 week in an attempt to get through the zoning districts in one month. And then if needed, we will have a final meeting during Phase 3 on April the 17th to wrap up. We have opportunities for community members to discuss the proposed ordinance changes and to ask questions, and those are on Thursdays after the Planning Commission meeting on Wednesday. We hold these coffees and conversation sessions at Fort Thomas Coffee from 10 to 11:45 a.m. and from 6 to 8 p.m. All community members are welcome to drop in anytime during those hours. At the Planning Commission meeting the following month, I report out what we heard or what I heard at that meeting. So the Planning Commission is aware of what was said at the coffee and conversation sessions the previous month. Article 1 of the revised ordinance includes all the sections necessary to administer the combined zoning and subdivision ordinances. We will spend the first part of this presentation briefly discussing these administrative sections. And as always, the Planning Commission, y'all feel free to interrupt and ask questions as I move through this. So the definition section is new for Phase 3. That was not included in any of the Phase 2 drafts. You will see that in this section, in the actual written portion, I have included all the existing definitions in italics if I'm using them. If they are being replaced, they are lined out. And if there are no indications, all the other definitions are new. You probably noticed that it's like 48 pages, and most of them are new. I really was striving to define all the land uses and all the key terms in the zoning ordinance, as well as the subdivision ordinance. As we spend the next several months going through all of this, please refer back to this definition section. And if you find a term that's not defined, let me know. That may be one I need to include. If you look at a definition and it doesn't make sense, let me know that as well. The goal for the definition section really is to provide clarity to the user of the code. In addition to the definition section, there is actually a subsection called measurements, which is new for many, many codes. This is a new wrinkle. We are trying to really graphically describe the terms that are in the definition section and also provide instructions on how to measure certain things, whether it's setbacks or lot width or those sorts of things. And so it's very graphically oriented, and it provides these instructions for all the kinds of things that we need to do in terms of measuring. And the example that you see on the screen, that's actually an example of what is exactly a lot, because the development standards differ, whether it is a corner lot, or whether it's a flag lot, or where it's a condo lot. So this is hopefully going to help people understand that by seeing it, as opposed to just seeing the words. In section 1.2, we establish all the zoning districts. We will be discussing these districts at depth in March, as I just said. As you see on the screen, all of the existing residential districts are being retained. As we discussed in both phase 1 and phase 2, we did add the R1TC district, which includes the streets that are the homes that are bounded by Miller, Lumley, Hagedorn, and Shaw. Due to the variations in lot sizes that we discussed during phase 2, I did create 2 sub-districts here for the R1TC district. And as I said, we'll discuss that more in March. As you will see also in the screen, there are a whole bunch of districts and sub-districts for the Central Business District. For the new Planning Commission member, right now the Central Business District, it's one district, one set of uses, one set of development standards that includes both downtown or the town center and Midway. And what we're doing here is differentiating between downtown or town centers, it's called in the zoning ordinance, and Midway, and then also further differentiating by creating various sub-districts that are recognizing the different characters that exist within these areas. So that's what all of those are. The traditional business district is currently what Inverness is. And then finally, I would again have the Alexandria Pike Mixed Use District that has 2 sub-districts as well, based on the conversations that we had during phase 2, because of the different characters of the Pike between the south and the northern end. And then the Neighborhood Commercial Office District, which is governing Fort Thomas Plaza, the non-residential uses at the corners of Highland and Grand, as well as that parcel at South Fort Thomas and Bivouac. There are 2 other standard zoning districts, which is the River Preservation District that runs along the river, obviously, and then the Conservation District. Then there are 4 special districts, all of which are overlays. The existing residential cluster residential development overlay is in your current ordinance, and then 3 overlay districts are being created as a result of this update. These include the Fort Thomas Overlay District, the Central Business Historic Overlay District, and the Tower Park Historic Overlay District. And again, we'll discuss these in much more depth in March. Before I move on to powers and duties, any comments, questions about any of that? As we talked about during the phase 2, this is not the final draft. So, we may, as we're moving through this in the next several months, if you decide, you look back at it and you say this doesn't make sense and it's an Article 1, just send me an email, catch me at the next meeting, and then we can start looking at further refining this draft. Section 1.3 includes the powers and duties for the zoning administrator, the city engineer, the planning commission, the tree commission, the design review board, and the board of council, which is what the city council is called, both in the code of ordinances and in the zoning ordinance. The zoning administrator administers and enforces the UDO, or the Unified Development Ordinance. The city engineer provides technical support to the city, including reviewing development plans, and then the planning commission, meaning this body, evaluates development plans and subdivision plats, as well as providing recommendations to the City Council on zoning amendments. The Planning Commission is also charged with considering waivers to the zoning and subdivision regulations and evaluating application for alternative equivalency requests. The Board of Adjustment considers appeals from administrative decisions. Typically, those are the decisions of the zoning administrator, but it doesn't have to be. The Board of Adjustment also hears zoning variances and conditional use permits. The board also considers changes to non-conforming uses. All of this is consistent with your existing code. We are codifying it all in one place. The Tree Commission provides recommendations to the Planning Commission as required by the city's code of ordinances. In the zoning ordinance, as it's currently drafted, the Design Review Board provides historic review for the Central Business District and the Tower Park Historic Overlay Districts. The DRB also provides recommendations to the Planning Commission when developments are proposed in the business and mixed-use districts, which are the Alexandria Pike Mixed-Use District and the Neighborhood Commercial Office Districts. In instances where a development plan is not required in the business and mixed-use districts, the Design Review Board will evaluate and act on exterior modifications in these districts. So what that means is, for example, someone just wants to change their facade along Alexandria Pike. That doesn't have to come to you, but it will have to come to them now, and then they will have the ability to act on that, absent you having any involvement at all. The DRB will also act on deviations or modification to the residential contextual standards that we talked about during phase 2, as well as the standards for the Fort Thomas Overlay District. And again, that is just for deviations or modifications. Under the normal course of business, the zoning administrator will handle those applications if they are in complete compliance. And Kevin and I did meet with the Design Review Board back in November to go over all of their expanded duties and to give them an opportunity to weigh in on the design standards. I think they were a little taken aback that they were getting all of this stuff, but they were generally okay with it. And then the Board of Council or the City Council considers and decides on zoning map and zoning text amendments. Anything about powers and duties that's concerning or surprising? Okay. So moving on to section 1.4, which is the development review process. This process is currently unchanged from the current ordinance. Applicants are being offered explicitly now the opportunity to have an informal meeting with city staff as a pre-application meeting. This meeting is completely optional, but it is in the zoning ordinance now. Then stage 1 plans, which are the more preliminary plans, are sent to the Tree Commission and the Design Review Board if they need to go there based on the ordinance standards. And then those boards will provide a recommendation to you. Then the Planning Commission hears the stage 1 application. The Commission reviews the recommendations from the Design Review Board and the Tree Commission, and then acts on the stage 1 application. The final step in the process is the stage 2 application, which is the more detailed plans, and those are considered and acted upon by the zoning administrator. Consistent with your current practice, as in your current ordinance and in this draft, if it's not a particularly complicated plan, it can all be done in one step, and it can come here, and you would be the final actor, as opposed to being a 2-step process. But that discretion is left to the zoning administrator. As indicated in section 1.5, we have retained the zoning permits as you currently have them, which are issued after the completion of the development review process to attest that the development complies with the zoning ordinance, or in some cases, the subdivision ordinance. As we discussed during phase 2, we are actually now incorporating a certificate of zoning and compliance, which is new. It replaces the certificate of occupancy, which is the language that's in your current code, which can sometimes be confusing because it gets confused with the occupancy permit that's associated with a building permit. A certificate of zoning compliance is a document issued by the zoning administrator which certifies that a project as constructed complies with the zoning ordinance and the zoning permit previously issued. So the zoning permit is saying, yes, you can build this, and you have your construction plans all agree with your development approvals. The certificate of zoning compliance says you have constructed it in compliance with everything.
Excuse me, Lisa, where does the certificate of appropriateness come in?
So the certificate of appropriateness, Chair, would you like me to entertain?
That's okay.
Okay. So the certificate of appropriateness is issued by the Design Review Board, and it is governed pretty much by the Code of Ordinances, which is outside of the zoning and subdivision ordinance. We do reference the COA in the section that talks about the Central Business Overlay District as well as the Tower Park Historic Overlay District. But the authority to grant those COAs is held under the city's Code of Ordinances as opposed to the zoning ordinance.
Okay, I understand, but the city, but not this board, but what board does that change? Because it used to be the DRB.
And that's unchanged. I'm just saying the authority to do that rests in the city's Code of Ordinances
As being the design review board.
as being the Design Review Board, but it is not within the zoning ordinance.
I understand, it's
Okay.
when we started saying certificate of it being close to.
Right, but it is two separate and
Well,
distinct.
I guess what I was indirectly asking is this a new name for what that certificate is?
No, it is not. But to add to your point though, so let's just, for example, say a project did go through the process in downtown, did get a certificate of appropriateness. Before the zoning administrator could issue the certificate of zoning compliance, they would have to make sure that any recommendations that were, anything that was on the COA from the DRB was complied with before the certificate of zoning compliance could be issued. So that would be something, that would be a check as a part of this
So
process.
then when it wasn't checked the last time, that's water over the dam, or under the bridge, or wherever you want to say.
This is an insurance that all the development approvals, whether they are given by the Design Review Board, by the Board of Adjustment, because it may have been a conditional use, whether it's by this board, has been met prior to them getting the certificate of zoning compliance, and they cannot occupy the building unless they have that certificate.
Okay, so that's, again, history is history, but we can't have that history again moving forward.
The only wrinkle I would say to that, there are situations, say for example, it's January and it's 6 degrees and they can't plant. They can't put in the necessary sure.
Totally reasonable.
So they would then get their certificate of zoning compliance, but they would then be required under this ordinance to then to post a performance guarantee. But again, we're not going to hold someone occupying the business because they can't plant a tree.
Fully agree. I'm talking prior to building.
Any other?
Thank you.
No problem. Section 1.6 is the conditional use permit. The existing process for conditional use permits is retained, and the process requires review by the Board of Adjustment. As is currently the case, in order to be considered as a conditional use by the Board of Adjustment, the use must be specifically listed as a conditional use in the applicable zoning district. Conditional uses are only heard by the Board of Adjustment, and at the time that they consider that conditional use, they will also act on the development plan if there is one associated with it. So in that particular sense, they would be the authority that would be acting on the development plan instead of you. As opposed to some communities, it's a two-step process where they have to go get the conditional use and then they have to come to you. In Fort Thomas, it is a one-stop shop if you have a conditional use, and it's all handled by the Board of Adjustment. Section 1.7 clearly separates appeals from variances. Your current zoning ordinance conflates the two, and it's very confusing. Appeals are appeals from the decision of the zoning administrator, and variances, as we've talked about extensively, are requests to deviate from the dimensional standards in the zoning ordinance, both of which are heard by the Board of Adjustment currently and under this ordinance as required by KRS 100. The existing process for variances is retained, which does require that they be acted on by the Board of Adjustment, as I said. Section 1.8 is amendments. This section includes the existing process for both zoning map and zoning text amendments, which includes a review and a public hearing by the Planning Commission, and then consideration and when appropriate adoption by City Council. All of that is pretty much unchanged. Before I move into nonconformity, which is a little more complex, any questions, concerns about those processes?
I guess my only question was, and this might be more of a question for Kevin, but he's not here. Is the intent for council at the conclusion of the phase 3 meetings to adopt the ordinance as a whole, or is it to adopt it section by section?
So I will tell you what I have understood as an answer to that question. As it's currently laid out, we are planning to have a work session with council in the middle of May, where we will go through every single solitary section. And they will then informally say what they have concerns about and don't have concerns about. And then at the end, they ultimately will have to adopt it as one ordinance.
Right.
But it's entirely possible that they may do it article by article and then have a final vote that does the whole thing. But we will be spending at least one day with them going through
Okay,
it.
so are you asking us this evening, the commission this evening, or is the intent for the commission this evening to make any vote, any comment specifically on any of these in terms of adoption, or is it just for review, basically?
So it's for review, but keep in mind that, just like with phase 2, y'all made lots of changes, and all of those were, to the best of my ability, all of those were incorporated in this draft. So what I would like for you to do is, if anything gives you pause, or you want to have discussion on anything, you want anything changed, that we bring it up tonight.
Okay.
So that when I do have this meeting, we all have this meeting with the council in May, I can say, this is the draft that the planning commission.
And that'll be a public,
Oh, yes.
a public hearing?
It will not be a public hearing, it will be a public meeting,
Okay.
meaning that, anyone's welcome to come. So, so I would like to be able to say to them, you know what, the planning commission is okay with these things, but they really did discuss and have concerns about this.
Okay.
I don't know that, your development review processes are roughly the same as they've always been. So there's probably not a whole lot of discussion there. But as we move through, for example, the sign regulations next month, that will be a time when we probably will have a lot of discussion, and I will say to council, this is the draft that the planning commission was given. They like these things, they didn't like these things. So it's likely that they would want us to make these changes. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
just wanted to clarify.
So nonconformity. This section clearly distinguishes between all types of nonconformity, which your current code does not do. There are nonconforming lots, nonconforming uses, nonconforming structures, and nonconforming site conditions. The nonconforming provisions recognize the existence of buildings, land uses, lots, structures, and site conditions that lawfully existed at the time the zoning ordinance was enacted or it was amended. And so the key to that is the adverb lawfully, but which do not comply with one or more of the current regulations contained in the ordinance. So in terms of nonconforming lots, the nonconforming lot means the lot is either too small or too narrow in width. There are no big changes, except that your current ordinance doesn't recognize that a lot can be nonconforming because it's not wide enough. So what is done in phase 2 as well as in phase 3 is that we've made the recommendation, we recognize that a lot can be nonconforming because it's too narrow as well as the lot area. Nonconforming uses are uses that are no longer permitted in the district, but were permitted prior to the zoning ordinance being enacted or amended, as I said. For nonconforming uses, we added, as we discussed in phase 2, that nonconforming uses can't be expanded. The relocation of a nonconforming use on a site is restricted. That we did lay out certain circumstances where structural alterations could happen to a building that housed a nonconforming use. We added provisions explaining what happens when a building housing a nonconforming use is damaged or destroyed. Specifically, the building can't be rebuilt if more than 60% of the replacement value or fair market value has been destroyed. And then as currently is the process, we retain that any change from one nonconforming use to another has to be evaluated and approved by the Board of Adjustment. The one thing that I would like to point out is you currently have a fair number of homes that are nonconforming uses. And in some cases, we are ameliorating some of those concerns, but in other cases, we aren't. So I did add in phase 2 and then amended a little bit slightly in phase 3 that for nonconforming residential uses, structures may be enlarged or altered, provided that no additional dwelling units are created. So for example, if it's a nonconforming home, If it's a non-conforming use because it's a residential use in a commercial district, if they want to add on a deck, they would be permitted to do so as a result of this language. Any enlargement or alterations to a single family or a two-family would then have to meet the standards for an R1C district. This language is put in there so that, I mean, yes, it's one thing to say that they could alter, they could add on to a non-conforming use, but the zoning administrator needs to know standards by which to evaluate it. So R1C is that. They could have new accessory structures, provided they meet the standards again for R1C and the other ordinance standards for for accessory structures. So that is a fairly large change that we talked about in phase 2. Just bring it up again, just so that you're aware that that would be giving more rights to non-conforming uses if they're residential in nature.
Elise, I have a question about non-conforming uses. It seems, I think of use as what are you doing in a building, meaning a business that may not be lawful, I hate to say lawful, not legal to do in that particular building. Of interest to me is the top bivouac, that my understanding is that they rent storage units there, that nobody knew about for many, many years, and it suddenly came to surface. And I don't know how, when it's not zoned to have storage units, if there's storage units. And they continue. And I looked into it and I did a lot of questioning. And I know that it's not apparent to the street. And it goes through a little secret pathway into the back and then stores stuff in there is what I understand. The homes on Altamont, on the right side of Altamont, pointing down to Sam. And I talked with Kevin about it, and he said he looked into it, or had someone look into it, and that when the waterworks was in that building, this was his explanation, I'm stunned still, it's hard for me to even repeat it, that they stored some of their equipment in there, therefore it's now available for storage. Now, in my interpretation, I've checked with several attorneys on this, that makes no sense. I'll pick for doing it just because it's the top of my mind. They're a restaurant. They store pots and pans, they store canned tomatoes, they probably store olive oil. They use it for their business. I don't think that that makes it able to have storage units for rent. To me, that leap was jumping off of a bridge. And each time I did discuss this with an attorney, and there were several of different specialties per se, and they're like, no. Somebody's just trying to make it like it's as if he doesn't think he'll be smart enough to figure that out. And unfortunately, I kind of am. Because, I mean, storing the equipment in the 60s for the waterworks, and it was a waterworks company, doesn't mean it's a storage unit for rent to people who want to store their, I don't know, taxes or grandma's dishes or whatever. So what do we do about something like that? That's what I think of when you talk about. When you say the word uses, that was my interpretation. Is that where this comes in?
So yes, anything that is a use that was established. So again, keep in mind that there's a difference between a lawfully established non-conforming use and a use that was not lawfully established.
I would say this is probably not lawfully established.
Right, and I don't know what Kevin said or what, so I can't really comment on.
Yeah, I don't think we can probably objectively answer your specific question in that particular location. I'm not even sure I'm familiar with what building it even is, but.
Dr. Beckmar's office?
Is it? Okay, well, I'm not really sure, but I don't think that we're gonna be able to answer that this evening.
That's what, we're not here for that today.
Yeah, it's way beyond the scope of why we're here. If you can bring it up with Kevin, if they want to bring it to me, I'll certainly get involved in it. But it's just not, that's
To me,
not the
that's a
purpose of
use.
tonight.
We're talking about the statute, though, we're not talking about specific uses.
I believe you are talking about lawfully
Joe, time out,
established.
time out. First of all, we're supposed to go through this and then there will be specific opportunities to interact. I think we need to get back to that. If you have questions about uses in general, please bring them up. If you've got a specific issue with that building, I think you should bring it up with Kevin.
I did.
He can, and then he can come to me, we can talk about it, and I'm happy to get involved. That's just not why we're here tonight. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I think what I'm hearing from this is, if this situation arises, not this particular location, and you have a lot of details on that, it's probably not important, but how would this, the way you have this structured in the regulation here, the ordinance, I'm sorry, how would the ordinance deal with this, I think is the question. You know, and how would that go through?
With existing things.
With the existing kind of setup. So let's say, I don't know if it got damaged or if someone did find out about it, how would this, non-conforming uses and lots and site conditions be dealt with within this section 1.9?
Okay, so if the use was lawfully established and it is simply a non-conforming use, then the ordinance, all the provisions that I just talked about would apply. If it's a situation where it's a use that was not lawfully established, there's a specific section of KRS 100, it's KRS 10237, I believe, which says that if a use was illegally established but has been in continuous existence for 10 years without being cited by the municipality, then it was to be considered a lawfully established non-conforming use.
Oh, Jeffy's real sneaky about it.
So,
So we're,
Just
you haven't been brought
comment,
up on.
folks, please.
So,
And back to the question there, assuming it was reported within that, before that 10-year period.
then, yes, so, yeah. So if it's in that interim period before the 10 years expires, comes into play rather, then it would be considered a violation of the zoning ordinance. And then we would go through the violation process. And that is actually the last slide I believe we have up here.
so is it 10 years after it was reported?
So I think we need to sort of go back to this discussion, yeah. But it is,
That was a good question, though.
yes. So there are as many of us who have administered codes know, defining the time frame is always difficult in these situations. And it's always site specific and always particular to the certain situation. So I hesitate to give an answer, given how fact specific it can be. But I'm comfortable telling you what KRS says, and I'm comfortable telling you what's in the zoning ordinance. But going beyond that, in terms of a particular situation, I'm not comfortable with.
Let's go ahead and continue, I guess.
I'm sorry?
Let's go ahead and continue.
Okay. So a non-conforming structure is a building that was already built and the current zoning ordinance was amended or adopted, as we've said. Non-conforming structures are buildings, for example, don't meet setback requirements. That's the typical thing that you see. As we've talked about ad nauseum in the last year, many of the homes in the city were built before the current setback regulations were adopted. We retained your existing provisions for non-conforming structures and added that non-conforming buildings could be expanded if the use is conforming and the expansion doesn't increase the non-conformity. And we've also added certain enlargements are permitted. Specifically, and I'm just going to read these to you. A non-conforming structure which is designed for and devoted solely to uses permitted by the district in which it is located may be expanded in a manner which does not increase the non-conforming aspect of the structure. So that's very detailed oriented. In a zoning district, and any single-family detached dwelling that has a non-conforming side setback may construct both a horizontal and a vertical addition that may likewise extend into the required side setback, as long as it maintains the same distance from the lot line as the existing non-conforming setback. Having said that, though, we all know how tight lots of these lots are. If it's going to be 5 feet or less, it has to go to the Board of Adjustment for them to consider it. So it just simply cannot be an administrative approval done by the zoning administrator. If it is not at that 5 feet situation, it could then be approved by the zoning administrator. So again, as we talked about, we are trying to deal with lots of the non-conforming situations that we have and give people the opportunity to improve their home if they would like to do so. So finally, we come to non-conforming site conditions, which is things lacking in landscaping, too small of a buffer yard, too few parking spaces. Those are examples of site conditions. As drafted, a non-conforming site condition when a revised development plan comes in front of you must be brought into compliance with the applicable regulations unless the Planning Commission determines that such conformance cannot be reasonably achieved because of existing site conditions. And again, this is a situation where we all know we have lots of existing lots, lots of existing site conditions. And do you want to prevent someone from investing in their property simply because they're lacking some, site conditions? And this is a tough thing for planning commissions. You come in, you tell people this is what they're required to do, and you make your best case effort to, make sure that you get as much landscaping or as many parking places or whatever the situation is, while still dealing with the fact that they want to invest in their property. As always, you're making trade-offs and trying to balance the situation. All right, so before we move on to waivers.
Sorry.
Yes, sir.
That's all right. I was going to make sure you weren't going to 110 because I wanted to go back to 109 or 1.9. Can you answer for me on 1.904? It's the non-conforming uses. It's part F. It's the damage or destruction. It's if the total cost to repair the damage to a building or structure in which a non-conforming use is conducted 60% or more of the replacement cost of fair market value shall not be reoccupied unless the use is permitted in the zoning district. Which I read to say basically if it's been destroyed 60% or more, then nothing can be built back. It can't be built back as that. It might have to be a smaller unit, different setbacks, etc. And I haven't had a time to read this. I read some of the sections that were outlined for, I thought, tonight's discussion. But this particular one, is there a out? In other words, if a home were to be destroyed, that the person could build their home back the way it was at that location? Or are we going to basically, in essence, evict people because their house burned down? I just want to make sure I understand that. That's what I'm reading that as.
This is on uses, though, non-conforming uses.
Yeah, this is a non-conforming use.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Thank you. Yeah, okay.
Yes, and that's a tough thing. We're all talking.
Right.
Yeah, you have to talk about uses versus structures versus
Right.
site conditions
No,
versus.
you're correct. Thank you.
And your code really is, your existing code and the current one is very good. So for example, if you have a non-conforming lot, you can build on it in almost all situations. If a home is destroyed, you can actually rebuild it as long as it was not your fault and you do it within 6 months. And all of that's been retained.
Thank you so much.
Not a problem.
That use is lost, if there was 60% destruction.
So yes, for example, if there is a non-conforming use and the building that houses it then goes away by 60% or more, then they can build back, but they have to build back with a conforming use. So moving on to waivers, modifications, and equivalency. The existing zoning ordinance already permits the Planning Commission to waive certain requirements, such as the parking in the central business district. This section specifically codifies that authority and provides a process by which to do so. Your current code does not. A variance permits a deviation from a dimensional standard, and in Kentucky, variances may only be given for dimensional requirements like setbacks. Therefore, many communities, not just Fort Thomas, permit waivers to permit departures from provisions that are in addition to those dimensional requirements. Section 1.10 lays out this process and has an application requirement that includes a statement of justification, and the Planning Commission is required to make certain findings before approving the waiver. And then you may also impose conditions to mitigate that waiver. So there are two instances or two bodies that are allowed to give waivers under the zoning ordinance. The Planning Commission is specifically allowed to do so only in certain circumstances. And you may think about, when we talked about this during phase 2, there was a discussion about whether or not you should be able to waive everything or only when specifically authorized in the code. The discussion that we had, you felt fairly strongly that you should only be allowed to waive in certain instances. And so in order for that waiver to be applicable, it has to say that within the code. And you may have noticed that as you were moving through. So specific examples that you are authorized to give waivers include parking locations, some of the landscaping and screening requirements, and certain development standards. The Design Review Board is given the authority to waive the design standards in the business and the mixed-use districts. Those are the specific design standards that are in this code. The board may also grant waivers and deviations to the residential contextual standards in the single-family districts, and in the R2 district as well, and in the Fort Thomas Avenue overlay district. And again, this chapter simply codifies that authority and gives you a process by which to do so. And then finally, this section also permits the zoning administrator to grant waivers from measurable and quantifiable standards. And those are pretty important words. You have to, basically it has to be a dimension in order for the zoning administrator to be able to grant a waiver. And that dimension is that you can't deviate by more than 10% from any of the standards. And then we talked during phase 2 about an equivalency provision, which gives the opportunity for an applicant to give an alternative method for satisfying a requirement in a manner that was not anticipated by the city. As currently drafted, the alternative equivalency review is only available for the landscape screening and lighting regulations, for the conditional use and restricted use regulations, and for the all-street parking, loading, and access regulations. So the question I have for you is, are these the appropriate sections to give an equivalency provision? Should there be other standards by which you want to be able to use it? Or alternatively, do you want someone to be able to use the equivalency provision for any standard in the code, knowing that you can only grant waivers if you're specifically allowed to do so in the code? The Board of Adjustment can only grant a variance if it's a number, setback, that kind of thing. So my question to you is, do you want to restrict equivalency to these sections, or do you want to open it up?
Can I ask what, in your experience, from what other communities typically do and how they would structure this?
Many communities, keep in mind, Kentucky is very unusual in that they are, the BOA is so limited into what they can grant. In most, and so waivers isn't even a thing in most places. In communities that do not have the waiver provision, the equivalency provision is in there in order to allow applicants to find a way to develop their site without having to go to the Board of Adjustment. And they then allow the equivalency provision for everything. And the reason that I say that is because in many places, including Kentucky, in order to get a variance, it's a very high standard. It's practical difficulty and undue hardship. And in many situations, just because an applicant wants to develop in a certain way because of certain site conditions, that doesn't rise to the level of undue hardship or practical difficulty. So it's very difficult to get the variance. Therefore, the equivalency provision allows the Planning Commission the authority to then give them the ability to update their site. And this is specifically, and the other answer to your question is, in built-out communities like Fort Thomas, the equivalency provision is very helpful. But you have the wrinkle that you have waivers, which are liberally given in this code, but not for everything. So do you want to tie your hands and only use the equivalency provision for these things? Or do you want to open it up to other provisions in the code? So keep in mind that you can give waivers to many of the landscape screening and lighting regulations as it's currently drafted. You can give waivers to many of the parking and loading standards. You do not have any authority to grant waivers in the conditional use and restricted use regulations, with some very narrow exception. That would be the attached single family. And then the Board of Adjustment is given some authority to grant some waivers, some deviations, if it's a conditional use. But beyond that, beyond the one restricted use that is a single family attached, they either have to meet the standards or they have to become a conditional use. That is their only other alternative. So that's a really long-winded answer to tell you that it's a very much a policy choice for communities. The equivalency provision is much more common in built-out communities as opposed to greenfields.
Can I ask what the negative aspect of having a fully open equivalency provision might be? Is it the fact that it would always be we'd make, I like standards, because then you can work against a standard, but this sounds like it, to me, allows a lot more flexibility. In your professional opinion, is it better to have narrow or open from other places, but I guess,
In Kentucky or other areas?
Yeah, I mean, because you're built out and you have lots of interesting situations in terms of sites of lots and all those kinds of things, I think it's better to leave it open-ended. But it is a policy choice between predictability and flexibility. You know, when you have defined standards, it's easy for you to administer and it's extremely predictable.
In my experience in
Colorado was the fact that we had very open standards, and they can be very conveniently adjusted depending upon, you know,
I guess the communication.
and whatever happened. So in other words, you know, someone wanted to come in and build a building, and I did design standards for building the building. Well, they're not gonna build, they're gonna walk if we don't change the standards. So we changed the standard, allow them to build the building differently, and
Through this,
this kind of construct. My point is that's not your standard then, right? So, okay, thank you.
And I've been doing this for more than 30 years, all through the Midwest and the South. So I've not been out west. Well, I was a planner in California. I've seen the equivalency provision used twice in that period of time. Because it's very clear in that there have to be meeting the standard in a way that was unanticipated by the city. So that's a burden that the applicant has to meet. They have to prove to you, they have to come to you and they have to say, you wanted us to do X. The intent behind X was this. And we understand that, and if you had level ground and a normal lot size and the building wasn't here and the water line wasn't there, we could do that. But we're gonna come up with this in a different way. And so therefore, we're gonna design the building this way or the site this way and still meet your intent for whatever the intent of the standard was. So it does give you an incredible amount of discretion and a burden of proof on the applicant that is fairly high. I haven't seen it used often, but I have seen it used in situations, and always in built-out communities, never in greenfields. Because if it's a greenfield and you have defined your standard, why can't you meet it? And we spent, the last year thinking long and hard about these standards, right? And so they're important, but we also know the kind of community that we're in.
So if we like having the standards and to be able to fall back on that and not have broad discretion, are there additional standards that we would want to open up instead of just opening it up to everything we can think of? Is there anything else that you might recommend that we allow changes based on what you know about Fort Thomas and the built-up health conditions?
I mean, these are the biggest ones, right? These are the places where you have the most opportunity for someone to use an equivalency provision if you want to give yourself some guardrails. As we've talked about a lot through this process, assuming this gets adopted this year, that's not the end. This is not a Bible. A year from now, if someone says, I really would have liked to have used the equivalency provision here, then we can go back and amend. But this is I chose these specifically because these are the ones that are most likely to need an equivalency provision from and to give you some guardrails. But by the same token, it's your policy choice.
I can just say, personally, I like having the standards and, everybody knows what they are and everybody can work under the same rules. Just my opinion on it.
Are you talking about just residential or everything here? Is this just residential?
No, this would apply to all districts.
Oh, okay, thank you, that helps a lot, gosh. Okay.
I guess my thought would be if we would delineate the specific sections that would be have an equivalency provision, I think adding section 5.2 as well, which covers the hillside development controls, I think would be illogical because every hillside development is going to have unique circumstances potentially. And then even to some degree, I think in the the design standards in the subdivision regulations, which would be 7.5, I think. Let's go back to the table of contents here. 7.5 and then 7.6, which are the improvements in the design standards, because depending on a specific site, there may be a particular reason why you want to do a street layout or a sidewalk layout or the stormwater. There may be provisions that a specific site may call for a unique design solution that may or may not be, in the subdivision regs. I could see where there could be a circumstance where that could come up.
What did you say, 7.5 and 7.6? Did you say 7.5 and 7.6?
Yeah, and 5 too.
7.5 and 7.6.
Yes,
Oh,
and 5.2.
I got the 5.2.
Okay.
So if you look at 7.7, it does give, let's see, in lieu of the waiver and modification, if you look at 7.705,
Okay.
You really already have the authority to grant or modify in the subdivision regulations because of that.
Okay.
So that's already built into it.
All right.
For all, and the standards by which you have to do, you have to find if there's unusual topographical or exceptional physical conditions, that strict regulations would then have extraordinary hardship, or that there are modifications that would give an innovative design.
Okay.
So you've already got that authority, but I think you're correct. I think adding the environmental regulations makes good sense.
Okay.
Are y'all okay with that? Yeah. Okay, so we'll add that as well. And as we move through, the next several months, keep this in the back of your mind, right? Notice where the draft code specifically says you can grant a waiver. And think about that. Think about these guardrails. And the things that I said to Kevin and Mark, and I don't know what, applications are coming in front of you. If you do get a site plan in, pull this out and look at it. It's not an effect, but use that as an opportunity to test this. So that we can start finding the flaws before it's even adopted. So the final section in Article 1 is the enforcement and penalties. Section 111 clearly lists what constitutes a violation of the zoning ordinance, which is not currently in your code. Section 111 also lists a number of enforcement actions, some of which are new. These include spelling out a notice of violation, a stop work order, an order for discontinuance, and a removal of a violation. So we have beefed up this section quite a lot. Not that I think you have a whole lot of enforcement issues, but when you have them, you need a good code. So we have added that as well. All right, any other comments, questions, concerns about Article 1? I mean, I know it's a lot, we went through it fairly quickly. Yes, sir?
So is tonight an introduction? I assume you invite comments and discussion on Article 1 next month, is that correct? Or is that for this evening?
We can have it now, or we can, we're in phase 3 of this process.
Sure.
So we've discussed these a lot during phase 2.
Right.
But if you want to, think about it, and we'll start the meeting next month with, hey, anything else you thought about in terms of Article 1 or Article 7?
Right.
We can add that to our agenda if that's okay with you. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, because for me, I got this on Monday at noon. And I read the sections that were outlined, and I didn't read the other ones, so I feel like I'm a little bit behind. So.
Okay, yeah, so why don't we do that? We'll open up the next meeting with any other thoughts, reflections on the meeting tonight. Okay. And again, even after that, if something occurs to you, please feel free to email myself or Frank or Mark or Kevin. And we can talk about it if we need to, or I can, if you find a typo or whatever else, we can just add that as well.
This is just a good time to open up the public comment.
We're just about there.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Does anybody have any specific comments on what we just talked about on the section 1, which is kind of the administrative part of the code?
Well, I need some clarity. Do I get up there and ask?
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. By the way, do
sessions today, tomorrow morning, tomorrow evening. They're so helpful. And then she comes back if a lot of, well, there's usually only 6, 8 people, 8 at the most probably. And then they say, this seems curious to us, and she'll look at it and she'll bring it back, giving some representation to the citizen. And she listens to them, and so as far as feedback goes,
Yeah.
there's some of that. They've been really useful.
Yeah, Kevin mentioned that to me last week. There was a thing tomorrow, but I'm not even going to tomorrow.
Pardon me?
Kevin mentioned to me last week that there was the coffee time thing.
Coffee and
Yes,
conversation, yeah.
And that I wasn't able to attend because I had other work
Oh, I see.
obligations. But yeah, no, I'm glad that they're having those type of conversations.
Yeah, it wasn't in the beginning, but within, several, it got resolved pretty quickly. But there were several requests, and she said, sure, it's worked out great.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sharon MacKnight, 62 Miller Lane. I appreciate all your services, your great questions, and thank you for allowing us to ask questions to understand this, because we don't even have that. I mean, I got it, but I haven't had time to even look, so it is a bit overwhelming. But my question is, because when I was reading the first, the 1.03 purpose of the Unified Development Ordinance Phase 3, and it's the same in the original 2012 current official zoning ordinance. It says the zoning and subdivision regulations and zoning districts as herein set forth have been prepared in accordance with the adopted comprehensive plan. Now, I know back in November, there was discussion of reviewing the comprehensive plan and then maybe going from there and forward with these zone code updates. Was there any kind of review or revision on any of this, our current comprehensive plan from 2018?
So it's my understanding that the city will, in the future sessions, not necessarily next month, but during 2024, we'll review the comprehensive plan, the existing comprehensive plan. And, I can't say specifically what the process is going to be and whatever changes may or may not occur to that, but there is a plan to do that in this coming year.
Because it would make sense, because you'd want the current input in the current situation, so you can, say this is what we're doing for the best for the entire community, and this is the updated version. So that makes sense, and I appreciate that. Also, when Lisa said built out, and that's the truth. I mean, on Miller Lane, we've had a MacKnight live on there since, 1919. So you went from all land and a few houses to you're all developed. So I'm all for, let's maintain, protect and preserve the historic small town feeling when going forward with these decisions. And that's my input on that. And I wish you guys keep that in mind, because I love the feeling, I love this town, and we're not going anywhere, and we'd like to retain that feel of that. So thank you for allowing me to speak and giving my input. Thanks a bunch.
I think
Specifically, Joan's question about enforcement, that would be 11106, you can pursue a violation through approaching the city and filing a violation through 11106, right?
Yes, that is true. That would be part of the process, yes.
And to that point, we as a commission don't have any enforcement jurisdiction.
Right.
Yep, all the enforcement is strictly through the zoning administrator. So that is an administrative function as opposed to the planning commission.
I'm not the one who reported it. It came up at one of Elise's meetings in the morning, saying, what's with the storage units? I never heard of them. I grew up on Crown. I passed that building every day of my life, walked the same homes every day.
The only question I have, ma'am, on section 1, or I guess section 1, or article 1, excuse me, is on the adding of the definitions or glossary section and whatnot. I noticed you created a glossary section for section 1, and then you also created sub-glossaries in article 7, for instance, you have sub-glossaries. What's the thinking behind that to separate them out versus having them in one location?
So in most situations, we try to keep all of the definitions in one place. For the subdivision ordinance, there are a few that are particular to it that we put there. There are also definitions, for example, in the sign regulations. But those definitions really are applicable to those particular sections as opposed to the code as a whole. So the ones that are in the front, we try to make for the code as a whole.
Right.
But you will notice, like for the definition of sign, it says see section, whatever, just for additional definitions. For subdivision, the definition says see section, so there's reference back and forth.
Yeah, so, because what I noticed in Article 7, that there was a discussion, and we'll get into it, but in their definition section covers some of the same things that are actually covered under Section 1, and I don't know if that was intended or unintended, like, you know, clarifying what the Planning Commission was is already clarified in Section 1, and then we're doing that again in Section 7, so I wasn't sure what the thinking was.
If there are duplicate definitions, then I made a mistake.
Okay. Okay.
And I will look to make sure.
Okay.
In some situations, I lined out existing definitions because they were in the first section, but I will go back again and make sure that I didn't duplicate.
All right, yeah, and when I go through it, I assume what we're doing is we can send these, I have typos and those kind of things, that, you know, substantial things we can talk about here, but typos I can send you. Thanks.
And hopefully the typos are minimal, but with 445 pages, I'm sure there are some. So moving on to Article 7, as we talked about in Phase 2, we've referred to it several times tonight, we are actually creating a unified development ordinance. Right now, the zoning ordinance and the subdivision ordinance for the city are 2 separate documents and 2 separate ordinances, and the unified development ordinance brings them all into one place. We are doing that just for ease of use so that all the development regulations are in one place. And so right now we will turn to the subdivision regulations, but I just wanted everyone to understand like why we suddenly started referring to this as a unified development ordinance and why we were talking about subdivisions when it's not typically a conversation that's had with zoning ordinances. The subdivision regulations govern the subdivision or dividing of parcels. Subdivision regulations, by their very nature, are process or procedure oriented. They are extremely technical. They contain engineering standards and drawings for constructing public improvements within subdivisions. The existing subdivision regulations were created in 1990, and no major updates have occurred since passage in 1990. Because Fort Thomas's subdivision regulations are so outdated, and there have been definitely engineering standard changes in that period of time, many of the revisions to this draft regulations really do reflect the changes in engineering technology in the last couple of decades. The UDO will have Article 7, which contains all of the sections for the subdivision regulations in one place. The subdivision regulations include all the requirements and elements from KRS 100. These include definitions. Again, those are the ones that are specific to the subdivision regulations themselves. The procedures for considering plats, the application for the requirement of plats, the standards for common elements of a subdivision such as lots and blocks and flood hazards, the engineering standards for streets, stormwater, and erosion and sediment control. So again, these are very highly technical documents. Section 7.0 lays out Fort Thomas's authority to actually utilize subdivision regulations, and during Phase 2 we pointed out that we really only made minor grammatical changes and changes to current language and terminology in this section. As I mentioned in Phase 2, we have also in Article 7 corrected the code citations to reflect the new format for the UDO, but we didn't make a whole lot of changes to 7.0. 7.1, as we just briefly discussed, we eliminated many definitions because they are in the definition section for the UDO. And then we did leave in place some of the definitions that are unique to the subdivision regulations.
I had just kind of just a higher level question, I guess, about section, or Article 7. You know, because we are a built-out community, very often we don't have major subdivisions. And just want to, you know, a lot of the language that's sprinkled through Article 7 references the subdivider or the subdivision. And a lot of our developments are neither.
Correct.
So what provisions included in Article 7 would apply if there is no subdivision?
So if you will notice in the language as we move through the next several months, I put in there situations that say, including the applicable regulations from the subdivision regulations. Say, for example, there are engineering standards within the subdivision regulations that would be applicable on a development site. That then gives the zoning administrator or the city engineer the authority to then apply those standards.
Right, it's just that a lot of the language in here specifically says subdivider or subdivision.
And I will make sure that subdivider is synonymous with developer, which I believe I have written somewhere.
Okay, I just, like I said, I just want to make sure that, you know, it is applicable to a situation where there is not strictly a subdivision incorporated in the development.
I'll find it.
But yes, I have that language somewhere, but I'll make
Okay,
sure that
okay.
yeah.
It's under developer.
It's under developer.
Synonymous
Yep.
with subdivider.
Yep, I
Okay.
said, the context of the subdivision regulations, developer is synonymous with subdivider.
Okay,
So again, those are the things that we want to make sure that we catch.
yeah, or so what language was Frank, or where was that?
That's in the actual definition section for the subdivider, for this,
Up at the beginning,
for the developer,
in
right.
the beginning?
In the, yeah, the actual 7.1, page 1.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So in Dave, and I don't know, I mean, maybe I'm jumping ahead on this, but like, I mean, like in the subdivision regs, we address stormwater controls. So obviously an acre or more, everything goes over the sanitation district.
Right, I just want to make sure somebody doesn't say, well, I'm not subdividing, so therefore you know what I'm saying.
And so,
We have controls for under an acre of development as well.
Right.
So,
but keep in mind, as we're reviewing this, if you see a situation where I have not said the applicable standards in the subdivision regulations, call that out. I have tried in every situation to make sure that I make those references. So that everyone, for two reasons. One, I want to give the city the authority to do so. And two, I want to make sure that the developer understands that they are going to have to meet those standards as well. So it's for both parties. Now, we always have the catch-all everywhere in here that says, other applicable standards, but that's not particularly helpful to the person who's reading this online. It is more helpful if we say applicable subdivision standards so they can then look at them. All right, so the existing subdivision regulations only define a subdivision, but not a major or minor subdivision. And we talked about this during phase 2. The process implications for the subdivision regulations and zoning regulations in terms of defining these terms. But for right now, let's hold off on discussing the process implications for the zoning requirements and focus on the subdivision definitions and process. In terms of a major subdivision, as we talked about during phase 2, we are considering defining it as a subdivision of land that contains infrastructure improvements or the construction of a public or private street. And when we talked during phase 2, you will notice that it's lined out now. I had said public infrastructure, and y'all pointed out that perhaps there would be a subdivision that would have private infrastructure, and we would want to define it as a major subdivision. So based on your recommendations in phase 2, I have lined out public so we can tell that it's a change from phase 2. And then for a minor subdivision is anything that does not contain a public infrastructure or the construction or a public or private street. But before we discuss these definitions, let's look at the process. So the procedures for a major subdivision are this. It is a 2-step process for a major subdivision that starts with a preliminary plat that is considered by the Planning Commission. If you approve that, the developer then does improvement plans for the streets, sewers, sanitary, any of those kinds of things. Then it comes to a final plat for you to consider. And then if you approve it, it then goes to recordation. Now, there can be a little bit of variation in that in terms of where the improvement plans come in and whether they construct the improvements before you do the final plat or whether they do a performance guarantee, but that's the basic process. So it's a two-step process for a major subdivision. And again, as it's currently drafted, major subdivision does not deal with the number of lots. It just simply deals with the ability, the need to have infrastructure. A minor subdivision with an identification plat, which we'll talk a little bit about more in a minute, is a one-step process. So it still comes to you for consideration. If you approve it, it gets recorded. So it's a one-step process. So as we discussed in phase 2, the current subdivision regulations allow this abbreviated process for an identification plat if it doesn't have the construction of public utilities, no more than 2 lots are created, the lot lines to be adjusted can involve more than 3 lots, and a preliminary plat has not been approved. Then they can use the identification plat process that is abbreviated into the one-step process. The qualifiers dealing with lot numbers and those kinds of things are policy decisions that were made by the City of Fort Thomas in 1990. These qualifiers are not in KRS 100. Just in 1990, the City of Fort Thomas said, only in these limited circumstances are you allowed to use this abbreviated process. When we talked back in phase 2, we talked about getting rid of maybe subdivided from the original tract to 1966. And that night, as we talked about then, 1966 came from the year that the state of Kentucky allowed municipalities to have subdivision regulations. And the thought process? Y'all hear me?
You don't understand. It just now started going in and out.
So when we had that discussion in phase 2, you said, let's get rid of from the original tract existing prior to 1966. And so that's reflected in this phase 3 draft. So what this does, this change basically allows any existing lot to be divided into 2 lots. Now what you need to keep in mind is this change could allow someone to circumvent the major subdivision process by proposing a series of minor subdivisions. Does this give you any level of concern? I mean, it's still, a very limited circumstances. Someone's adjusting a lot, someone's dividing their lot in half. Would use the abbreviated process, and they don't have any public improvements.
And I would say that is typically our lot divisions are the majority of the cases that we review are similar to that, so.
Is there a reason not to use the other process? I mean, it's more onerous on the person wanting to do that, but they're the ones,
Yeah, I would say, typically we have a lot of lot splits where it's, a property owner is either selling a portion of their back property, their backyard, or it's just, they're conveying 10 feet to their neighbor to build an accessory structure or something like that. So it's not really truly a subdivision, really.
Not a development type thing.
It's not a development type thing, it's just more of a convenience thing to adjust them for setbacks or something like that.
Elizabeth, would this circumstance where you're subdividing, the one time you introduced to us on one of the day afters, what tiny houses are, I hear nothing but tiny houses now, and so much publicity. Would that lot have to be subdivided to put a tiny house in the back? Some of them are really interesting.
So this situation is the lot still has to meet the standards for the zoning district.
Okay,
So whether or not it's a tiny house or it's a regular house, it would still have to meet the minimum lot size. And in this particular circumstances, in your R1 districts, you also have minimum standard sizes for homes.
oh, do you?
Yes, that is currently in the R1 district. So what this does is say you can divide a lot, but you still have to meet the zoning ordinance standards in terms of lot width and lot area.
Thank
All right, so are you okay with these definitions as they're currently drafted, or do you have any concerns? And we can, and we talked about last time and briefly mentioned, there are some process implications to defining a major subdivision this way, specifically as it relates to the environmental regulations that are in Article 3. But, excuse me, Article 5. But we can talk about it more then and come back and change this definition if we want to. But generally speaking, are you okay with these definitions? In this phase 3 draft, we did add a subsection describing how the city accepts subdivision improvements, which was not in your previous draft, in the phase 2 draft or in your existing regulations. Essentially, if there are improvements, they're inspected. If they're approved, the streets are accepted by the city within 45 days after recordation. And in certain situations, performance guarantees can be posted. This is not particularly revolutionary. It just lays out the process.
So what is the, and I don't know that it applies here, it doesn't apply here, but if the city instituted a performance bond for, before the construction of the improvements, is the release of that bond tied to the zoning ordinance, or is it tied to the acceptance of the right-of-way or the acceptance of the improvements for release of that bond?
Say that again.
So if there's a performance bond
Yep.
posted by a contractor or developer, and the city holds that bond, is the release of that bond incumbent upon the acceptance of the improvements in this, as delineated right here?
So they will not have their bond released if you haven't accepted them, because and the only way you can accept them is if they have been inspected.
Right, so I mean, it would reference this section.
Correct. Yes, okay.
Okay, that's all, just want to clarify.
Okay.
But there's no language that we need to include in the zoning ordinance that relates to that.
No. You want to add anything to
I
that?
don't know if that's,
No,
I don't know if that's in this, the municipal ordinance, but that's.
You got me thinking, because what's the mechanism if, I guess the mechanism is they don't get their certificate, if they don't get their certificate, and they don't have their completion, then the performance bond doesn't get, released, right?
So let's back up for a second. So there are times when you have performance bonds in different situations. So you can, for example, post a performance guarantee and go ahead and have your final plat approved prior to building any improvements. So that's one situation. The other situation is, say for example, the sidewalk is not going to be put in place until the actual lot is built on, right? But you still want to give them the ability to then to sell a lot and start building it, right? Because you're not going to get the sidewalk until the house is built. So what would happen is, until that sidewalk, you would have them post a bond for that sidewalk, even though the subdivision has been approved and recorded, and that bond doesn't get released until it's constructed. Approved, constructed, inspected, then they release the bond. So keep in mind that whether or not you issue a permit for the house and you allow the house to be occupied is a separate and distinct process from the inspection and acceptance and release of bond, of money for it. So,
And that is in 7617.
so just keep in, because we can't conflate the two, and you cannot keep someone from occupying their home if they have complied with all the building code requirements. All you can do is say, I am not going to release your performance bond if you have not constructed that sidewalk.
And you don't accept the improvements.
And you don't accept the improvements, right,
So
yeah,
you're not responsible for maintaining it.
right,
We're liable if something happens.
right. So let's just, and I know that it seems like it's a little bit pedantic to make that differentiation, but it's important to do so. Because I had been in the situation where I had people who tried to hold up the occupancy, and that didn't go very well. Frank, do you want to add anything? Okay. Section 7.3 and 7.4 list the submittal requirements for preliminary and final plats. During phase 2, we made very minor changes to these sections. We did update code citations and made some edits to reflect current practices like electronic submittals. Section 7.5 becomes much more technical and includes the details like required right-of-way widths and site distance requirements. During phase 2, Robert Seitzinger with CT updated all of these tables in the sections as well as illustrations, again, because all of those were sorely lacking from 1990.
I mean, I did have a few comments on the section 7.5, but they're more specific verbiage things that I can.
Yes, if you don't mind emailing to me, and then if they're in any way policy oriented, I'll bring them back next month.
No, I don't think they're policy oriented, it's more references and some things that.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate that. 7.6 mandates design standards for public improvements necessary in major subdivisions. Again, CT rewrote most of this section to incorporate sanitation district number 1 engineering standards.
I guess the one thing I was just going to point out, like it's on the section 7.6 and it talks about the reference for the flooding. It references the flood map of 1973. And obviously, that needs to be the current FEMA flood map, not the one from 1973.
Yeah, we should definitely just put current.
And I was just curious, and you may not know, I don't know, Frank, if you know, but just like the table that you have with the right-of-way widths and those things, does that vary significantly from what we have in the prior subdivision regs?
It does not the right-of-way widths. I mean,
It's all about the same.
Correct.
Now, we did change, what page is that, Chair, do you remember? We did change, if you remember, that the right-of-way width slightly. So we did, or the pavement width. We decreased the pavement width for local streets during phase 2.
Yeah, I thought we did, that's why I was
Yep,
thinking.
yep. That's the only change that I made from phase 2 to phase 3. Otherwise, they're very similar to what we currently have.
And I will say, just for continuity's sake, and I don't know, I don't know if the planning commission is fine with this. These subdivision regs are very similar to what Campbell counties are as well. So it does create some continuity.
Yeah, there's also, and this is something I was going to mention, I'm trying to remember what page it was on, but there was specific reference for if there's any arterial collector streets as delineated on the area-wide comprehensive plan. And our comprehensive plan doesn't delineate streets.
Oh, that is, go ahead, Lisa.
So that is a current deficiency of the comp plan, and one of the things that will definitely be added when we update it, because it needs to be done. And we've already started working on that map.
So would that cross-reference like the proposed KYDC 6-year plan? Because it's for proposed streets.
It does not, so.
We don't have any proposed streets.
Right, we don't have any, right, and we won't be, they are. Let me go back and look at that actually. I was more thinking just that existing streets would reference the.
I mean, it's basically just said replicate the existing street.
Right.
But if it's a new street, it has to be in conformance with comprehensive plan, proposed streets, and our comprehensive.
Doesn't have it,
proposed
right,
streets.
correct. We don't have any proposed corridors.
Right, right.
Yeah.
As far as I know. So, anyway, I just think that cross-reference needs to be
Okay.
looked at.
Thank you. And then the final section is for the administration and enforcement. In terms of changes to this section during phase 2, we eliminated those subsections that are no longer needed, since the subdivision ordinance will be a part of the UDO, and made other minor edits to this. For the appendices, CT also revised all the engineering details for pavement design, streets, sidewalks, and driveways. And then since the adoption of the subdivision ordinance in 1990, appendixes D and E were lost. Kevin couldn't find them anywhere. So we recreated these appendices to list the certifications that are required for final plats and identification plats. And so, and we drafted all of those, and they're a part of this as well. I don't think Kevin had any concerns with them, but if you have any concerns, let me know. They're all fairly standard to Campbell, Kenton County. They're nothing particularly earth-shattering. Any other planning commission comments on Article 7 before we open it up?
That section that you turned to page 2 on the guarantees, and Kevin would be in charge of determining the improvements that have been completed in compliance and point where you release them.
Right, and it would be a combination of technical assistance from the city engineer as well as sanitation district number 1 or any other authorities that may be affected by the public utilities.
Okay.
And so, for example, he would not release anything if sanitation district number 1 said, we don't like this.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we removed just on the stormwater drainage, I think we removed the requirement that we had previously that all stormwater drains to a sewer.
We did remove that requirement. And we talked about that during phase 2, and
Right.
Robert and I made sure that that happened.
Okay.
Yeah. So do we have any, is it okay if I open it up to the community?
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Are there any questions about section 7?
I have an overall comment. I thought that we would be able to speak before the meeting, but I guess I'm used to the council words before. I do have something I want to share that's not specific to section 7.
All right. There are no questions about section 7 from anybody else?
This would have made more sense in the beginning. Anyway, my name is Joan Ferris. I live on Bernie Lane in Fort Thomas. I stumbled over the third draft of the Unified Development Ordinance, the UDO, and have a question and along with a couple of comments. The question is whether the newly hired historical preservation consultant will be involved in advising the Planning and Zoning Board of the effect these changes will have on the future of the established historically preserved areas in our city. Does anyone happen to know that answer?
I've not talked to Matt about that specifically, but I can tell you that knowing why he's been brought on, I'd be surprised if he's not incorporated into that process.
Thank you. Great answer.
Okay, so have they retained somebody?
Yes, we've got a contract with him, I believe it's been signed already, but we've got a gentleman and I can't remember his name.
Wes Cunningham?
Yes, that's it. And he was recommended. Joan, you may have been part of that process. I know Peggy Maggio was.
We interviewed him
That's right.
and checked.
And brought
Other
him to the
things.
city and Matt met with him a couple times, I think.
Probably.
And then I had a contract come across my desk probably a month ago.
So is he a consultant or is he a
He'll be a
staff person?
consultant.
Okay.
Consultant.
Like an as needed
Yes.
type.
Essentially, the boards and Matt will determine when and where he's necessary and where he fits.
Okay.
And I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, and I didn't do anything with the contract for sure, limited to the historical preservation areas of our city.
Correct.
Like, I don't think he would play into a huge part of what this process here is.
Is he pre-qualified by like the Heritage Council?
You know, to speak to his exact credentials, I can't. It's been a while since I looked at everything. The guy, not to sound too general here, but seemed extremely qualified. He sharp guy, he's got a lot of experience. I think he'll do a great job.
A vast array of experience, it seemed to us. I had his resume, but that's been months and months ago, so I can't refer to it as well, but he came well-rounded, and we interviewed several people. We didn't just hear of him, and
Yeah, it's just if you're going to deal with anything on the state or federal level, they have to be pre-qualified, that's all.
And I believe he is. Really, I didn't even actually see his resume. It was an email that was sent with the contract that he and Matt had talked about. So to answer that for certain, I don't know.
Does he work at Granite Gate?
Where?
At Granite Gate.
I believe that's it.
He likely is. Like I said, I was just.
fair questions. I'm hopeful. And I'll tell you another thing. He was so easy to talk to, and he knew his stuff, and his approach, I found, I don't know if you found this, Tim, as well, he was very easy to both understand, to communicate with. He seemed as if, and he wasn't playing sides, I can tell you that.
I didn't get to speak to him.
Oh, you didn't? I thought you
just
said
got
you
a
did.
contract. No, Matt.
I see, okay,
Matt.
okay. Anyway, after, that was the one question I had, and I appreciate your answer. And my comments, my understanding was that what was formerly entitled the official zoning ordinance would be simplified to make it, for lack of a better word, a more user-friendly and understandable document. I am having trouble rationalizing how a 195-page document could become a 444-page document by simplifying it. Just doesn't correlate. Another comment relates to the definitions of must, will, and should, as defined in section 1.1.01, Rules of Interpretation, section A, bullet point number 2. To paraphrase, must means mandatory, may signifies a permissive requirement, should is a preferred suggestion or recommendation. Must is mandatory, may and should are not mandatory. Within the 444-page draft of the UDO, must, the mandatory part, is used 64 times. Should, which isn't mandatory, was used 93 times, and may, which is not mandatory, was used 630 times. Total, it was 64 items are mandatory, 723 are not mandatory. I don't understand, again, how that is tightening the code. Approving 723 references using the non-mandatory wording would gut the design review guidelines, which are firmly established, to its core. Every matter, excluding 64 items out of the 444 pages, would become not mandatory, simply subject to the discretion of 5 appointed unelected volunteers. If July is the target date for approving this large UDO, that would mean starting tonight, approximately 75 pages would need to be read and fully understood by each and every member of Planning, Zoning, as well as each and every member of City Council, as they will be voting on it as well. I'm not sure if even Evelyn Wood could accomplish this, at least not with full understanding. I laugh at whoever knows who Evelyn Wood is. She was this speed reader who had like 150 offices around the country to learn how to read quickly, but still not with full understanding. My final comment regards the comprehensive plan. At every early public meeting about changing the zones or reviewing the zones, Elisa made it very clear that the comprehensive plan serves only as a guideline and nothing in the plan is mandatory. This was made very clear at every meeting. Suddenly, the latest draft uses the phrase comprehensive plan 51 times. In accordance with, the phrases are such as, in accordance with the comprehensive plan, will not violate the comprehensive plan, consistent with the comprehensive plan, just about every way of phrasing it in contradiction to what was said at every early meeting during this process. That the comp plan was only a consideration and in no way a mandate. Keep in mind that the comp plan by which this draft document is abiding is outdated, now 6 years old, not to mention based on false data. This has been confirmed at several zoning meetings over the past 2 years. And City Council meetings. I realize that hours and hours have been invested in this project. I'm only guessing that you all can't even begin to accurately guess the number of hours many plain old citizens with no power or authority, just their love for and honor of the city have spent. But having hours already spent is no reason to spend more at this time. A 440-page document with this type of verbiage cannot be passed or even come up for a vote until it is fully understood. Can we use this next month to have Planning and Zoning and City Council read and comprehend the first 75 pages
enough so that they are prepared to answer questions about how they intend to implement the changes or enforce the new rules. And that would be, if you did 75 a month, by July, it would be complete. But if you skip a month, to me, it should delay a month. I cannot fathom a reason why this needs to adhere to an imaginary and now unreasonable deadline for voting and implementing such massive changes. There's simply too much at stake here. I thank you.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All right. We have a motion to adjourn in a second. All on orders, or everybody in favor, I'm sorry. Say aye. Aye. Okay, we're adjourned for this evening, and there will be, I believe, a joint city council and planning commission meeting in February. So please, if you're interested, please plan to attend that for further discussion.
Is it at the regular council meeting or at the regular zoning meeting?
It's at the regular council meeting.
It's the 20th?
Yes, the 20th, because the 19th is President's Day.
Yes.
So it'll take precedence over normal city council business.
I won't make that statement, but it will be a part of the agenda.